This podcast has stories of real-life events and true crime that happens every day. These stories may contain adult language and graphic or disturbing details not suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
132 in Bush, I've got him at gunpoint. Check the left phone for going to full evacuation at this time. They're pulling them out.
10-1-1. Advise ready for camp.
God!
Welcome to another episode of War Stories. I'm Chuck, and unfortunately, Tom's not here today, but I am greeted and graced by the presence of Keith. Sir, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Good. So Dylan reached out to Keith, and Keith, he's retired from the U.S. Navy. He retired in Navy in 97, right? You have a
Correct.
master's degree from Webster University in 2000, and you wrote and published a book on military service and observations in 2017. You have read and studied minority military service for decades, along with playing at restoring an old house and digging in the dirt. Now, you also wrote another article that was just released, correct?
Yes, I did. I wrote an article about the first black naval officer that was commissioned in 1917, Lieutenant Garrison Payne, and I also wrote a new memoir, an updated memoir in 2024, Black Officer White Navy, a memoir.
Oh, okay. That's really interesting, and we are definitely going to get into that and talk about it. So for those that are listening, you are an accomplished author, and you are a career Navy gentleman. Tell me a little bit about how your journey in the military started. What caused you to want to go into the Navy?
Well, it started with the fact that my father was in the Navy. He was a boatswain mate, real seagoing sailor, served on eight or nine ships, 4 trips to Vietnam. Before that, he was a paratrooper and served in Korea. So I come from a military family. His father, my grandfather, died in a VA hospital in 1948. He served in World War II and got some sort of respiratory illness from his service and didn't survive much longer after the war. But I was a nerd and I wanted to learn as much as I could. So I convinced my parents to buy me a set of encyclopedias when I was in elementary school. Okay. And I read that set of encyclopedias from A to Z. But I was always drawn to the pictures of the naval officers in there. In those fancy uniforms, big bushy beards, and saying stuff like "damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." I wanted to do that, so that was the genesis for my interest in the Navy.
Okay, so you said you were a nerd. Did it remind you of like? Now I'm really bad with dates and things like that, but was that around kind of like when Star Trek was kind of around, and it made you feel like kind of like on the bridge of like a ship or something like that?
Absolutely, yeah. I joined in '75, so Star Trek had been around a little bit, and I thought Mr. Spock was cool. So it was, if I was going to be anybody, it was going to be Mr. Spock.
So it was just your love for all that nerdy stuff and that just looking cool in uniform, and that brought you to your call for service. Yeah. That
and the fact that the girls seemed to like the uniforms.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. Then why not go in the Marine Corps?
Good question. But I was more interested in the Navy than any of the other services.
Right. So how long of a career did you do?
I served a total of 22 years. About 9.5 of that was as an enlisted guy. I came in with a guaranteed A school, Mineman A school. Went through Mineman A school, and they put me in the admin office after I graduated Mineman A school. I served 2 years in Charleston with 2 6-month deployments, 1 to Scotland and 1 to Sicily. And then I converted to a yeoman while I was a mineman, and I went to legal clerk school and became the mast yeoman down in Guantanamo Bay. They had a 30% RIF, reduction in force. So I relieved a chief and a first-class petty officer as an an E4. So I was working 7 days a week trying to keep up with that workload. It was one of the hardest jobs I ever had, just in terms of volume. And then after that, I decided I wanted to become an equal opportunity program specialist based on some of the stuff I was seeing as a legal yeoman. So I did that for a couple of years. In the meantime, I'm getting college credits, taking classes, clipping exams and stuff. And when I finished my equal opportunity tour, I had applied for LDO, I'd applied for an enlisted commissioning program, and been rejected both times. And my third shot was applying for OCS once I'd completed my bachelor's degree. So when I applied for OCS, I got selected on my first try, and then I became an officer, surface warfare guy.
Wow. I like how you went about the officer route. I mean, I always loved when we had our officers that went the enlisted side first, and then they came out the other end, and then they became officers. They were so much a more well-rounded and better leader and motivator because they knew what it made the bottom line tick. It was awesome. So great on doing and becoming a what we call Mustang, I guess, in the Marine Corps, and going from enlisted to officer. That's amazing. So did you notice a difference in people respect and stuff like that from being a brand new officer, going from enlisted to officer, or did it not matter?
Well, it mattered. Luckily for me, I looked pretty young. I came in at 17. I quit high school when I was 17 and knew everything and joined the Navy. Mm-hmm. So I didn't look much older than the average ensign. And we had 10 ensigns on my first ship. And I was the only black officer on the ship, but I didn't look much older than those guys. They didn't know I was prior enlisted until I stood quarterdeck watch as OOD, and they saw the good conduct medal and I had good conduct medal, 2 of those, and I had a Navy Achievement Medal that I'd gotten, but I didn't have any sea time. My first ship was my first time I'd served on a ship in the Navy, and I knew if I was going to make CNO, I had to make up for a lot of lost time. So I did 4 consecutive sea tours trying to get promoted early. So, but no, initially it was not, it wasn't hard for me. It was easy. I had it easier than most of those guys because I had 10 years in the Navy.
Yeah. So a lot more respect there coming down from the other guys, because they're like, he's been here for a really long time. I noticed that a lot with guys who were coming down and they were officers or enlisted prior, and then became officers, and it was night and day difference. And it was just the way that they spoke and carried themselves was amazing. Great leaders. What was it like being the only black person on a ship like that? I mean, that had to have been a tough and trying time. Well,
it was. My first ship, I was only a black officer, and it was great. I mean, I had 2 great skippers. One of them was one of Zumwalt's young Turks. He had served under Admiral Zumwalt, and he was really big on giving people responsibility early. And he took a liking to me for some reason. So I was the CMS custodian for both skippers, and it was my first tour as an officer. Was real. I couldn't have gotten any better leaders. But I would occasionally have some young enlisted sailor standing watch or something, or just in passing say, "Well, Mr. Green, the only reason you're an officer is because of affirmative action." And I would love that statement, because then I'd take them to school. I'd say, "Okay, here's how I got to be an officer," and I'd go through the process. I said I put myself through college in my spare time when I wasn't working a part-time job. I was going to college, working a full-time Navy job, and doing 40 hours a week at the enlisted club, being the night manager there. So I had no time to rest or do anything else. So I said, now I put myself through college, came in as a high school dropout. I went to OCS like anybody else graduating from college. So what part of that is affirmative action? And they would sort of mumble and say, "Well, sir, I didn't know all that." I said, "Well, that didn't stop you from making a judgment about how I got to where I am." So, I love those teed up softballs. It never happened after my first ship, because after my first ship, I was a communications officer, but I was greedy and I was trying to get promoted early. So I went down in the hole with the snipes and learned the 1,200-pound steam plant in my spare time. Once again, going without sleep and rest learning the engineering plant. So I qualified as a steam engineering officer of the watch, as communications officer, as a lieutenant JG. So,
Wow. And why did you want to do that?
Because I wanted to get command of my own ship, and I knew that I had 10 years already, in the bag. And if I was going to do that, I was going to have to stand out, do everything early, do everything well, and maybe, just maybe, I might get command of my own ship. That didn't happen, but that steam engineering letter, when I went to department head school as a JG, I was one of 2 JGs there, and the other guy happened to be black also. And there was one ship on the list for department head school that nobody wanted, and it was a frigate out of Mayport that had all sorts of problems. Chief engineer was at the fat farm because he needed to lose weight, and there was a senior chief from the squadron running that ship, and they were getting ready to go to Guantanamo Bay 2 weeks after we graduated. I wasn't worried about that because I had no engineering background and no engineering experience and no gas turbine experience. So lo and behold, the junior guy in the department head school class, the 2 classes, gets the worst ship on the list. So I went and talked to the captain detailer when they gave the slate. I said, sir, I believe there's been some sort of mistake with my orders. He said, Lieutenant, there's been no mistake. Those are your orders. You're expected to carry them out. And I just felt like I'd been set up to fail. And it was the absolute worst 22 months of my entire adult life. It was an 18-month tour, but the guy who was supposed to relieve me failed the tactical action officer exam, so he had to roll back to the beginning. So I had to do 4 months of his tour in addition to mine.
Oh.
And I was the only black officer on that ship, USS Boone, out of Mayport, and that was a very difficult tour because I just ran into a buzzsaw of subtle and blatant racism, and I couldn't get help when I needed it, so I had to get creative. I had to create a discrimination spreadsheet showing my captain that the supply officer was slow walking and not ordering all the parts I needed to deploy. We're supposed to deploy in 30 days, and my parts are being held up and canceled, and I'm having to resubmit them and all this stuff, and I'm getting further and further behind. We had an explosion at sea doing helicopter ops, and I wound up having $1 million repair in addition to everything else I had to do to get the ship ready. And then our shaft seal, emergency shaft seal, inflatable shaft seal, it kept failing. So I wrote these Nobel Prize worthy casualty reports trying to get the Navy to replace that seal because I didn't want to be sinking in the middle of the Persian Gulf. So I wound up convincing them to replace that with a prototype seal, and that was another $1 million worth of repairs. So I got 2 big projects going on. In addition to everything else I had going on, and my supply officer is doing his best to make sure that I fail.
What I don't get that. Like it's that whole just blatant racism coming from a supply officer who's supposed to be supplying the ship and everybody, making sure that everybody else is safe. Yet he's blatantly putting everybody else in danger. Like that just doesn't make any sense to me. It's rude. Racist.
Well, yeah, it is rude, and it's not in accordance with what everybody thinks is supposed to happen or is going to happen. But in real life, people bring their prejudices with them.
Yeah. You're supposed to check your ego at the door, but they bring that shit with them, and they bring their biases and all that other BS that comes along with all that negative stuff. And it sets up your whole team to fail. It's like it has no business in the military. Glad I didn't have to experience a lot of that stuff while being in the military. It seems like, though, you experienced a lot of that on that deployment. Was there anything that stood out that was just, you're like, what the heck, that caused you maybe not to want to keep going? I mean, because you're pretty well into your career. You're over 10 years deep into this career at this point, right?
Yes. I was about 12 years in, 13 years in. The absolute worst thing that happened to me on that deployment there were a lot of bad things that happened. Starting with a helicopter crash, first day in the Med on the way to the Persian Gulf, and I wound up drawing the lucky straw to conduct the Jagman investigation. But the worst thing that happened was towards the end of the deployment, and I had a racial incident about every 3 weeks. I had to put a chief on report for disrespect and disobeying a lawful order. I had an ensign punch me in the stomach when we were in the wardroom, just he and I together. he'd been threatening to kick my ass for a while, and I just ignore him. And one day we were in the wardroom alone, and he punched me in the stomach as I was walking past the couch. He did not expect me to knock the hell out of him, which I did, punched him in the stomach as hard as I could. And when he jumped up and asked me what the hell's wrong with me, you're crazy. And I just looked at him. I said, look, you hit me, I hit you back. What's the problem? He never put his hands on me again, and I didn't have any more problems out of him. But he was just waiting, biding his time for his chance to kind of put me in my place. He's a Southern guy, and that was his deal. But the absolute worst thing that happened was we were at Anchorage in the Persian Gulf. I forget where it was. I probably shouldn't tell you anyway. But everybody else had gone ashore, and the whole Persian Gulf cruise, I tried to stay on the ship because I needed to be close because I was an engineer, and you never knew what was going to happen. So we needed to move the floating barge that was alongside us. We were at Anchorage. The weather had picked up, and it was moving down the ship a little bit. So I called the working party. I think I was one of 2 officers left on the ship then. CO, XO, all the other department heads are gone. Right. So I mustered a working party, and I said, we need to shift this forward a little bit because the brow is getting too close to the edge. I gave them instructions, divided them into two groups, and said, we're going to slack these lines, and then once those lines are slacked, we're going to move it and then tighten everything back up. And I felt very confident and safe, so I went down on the platform so I could get a good feel for how everything was looking. Well, I saw some of the guys on one side of the lines talking to each other and looking at me, and all of a sudden, after they'd slacked those lines, they just dropped them and walked away. And I just about shit my pants. I mean, I was just dumbfounded because the platform started drifting away from the ship, and the brow was getting closer. And if I lost that brow, my captain and XO and all those people wouldn't be able to get back on the ship. We'd need a crane or something to pull it out of the water. And I thought, this is the end of my career. And I yelled and screamed into the radio, and I held on to that brow with both hands while I was on that platform. I knew I wasn't going in the water with it, but it was within 12 inches of going off the end of that platform. So a bunch of the guys ran up, and they got it all secured. So when I mustered the working party afterwards, I wanted to know what the hell was going on. Who authorized those men to leave, and why did they do that? And I got all these sullen looks, and that was the one time I felt very unsafe on my own ship because I thought these guys were setting me up to fail, and I didn't know a lot of them because they weren't engineers, and but they obviously had a problem with me and didn't like to be bossed around by me, and they almost cost the ship a huge issue. I'd had so many problems with other things, I didn't make a big deal with it to the captain because I knew he wouldn't do anything. But that was the absolute worst time on that deployment. Pretty much the worst time of my career.
So they literally just set you up to fail on purpose, just strictly because of race.
That is the only conclusion I have been able to reach, and I think about this regularly.
Horrible.
But yeah, that's what happened.
Now it seems like, I mean, you've had your fair share of all that stuff, like racism and bad times in the military. I'm sure you had some good times. But it that seems difficult, and that seems really, really hard to do. And you did a career. What kept you going? Like, what kept you on that onward path of just, I'm going to keep doing everything I can, best of my ability, and just keep pushing this.
Well,
aside from everybody else, like doing all that crazy shit.
I wanted to command my own ship, and when I told my father I was joining the Navy, he said, "No, you're not. I'm not allowing you to join the Navy. The Navy's too racist. I'm not signing any papers, for you to join the Navy." Mm-hmm. I said, "No, Admiral Zumwalt fixed all that. That was in the past." And he says, "I'm not signing the papers for you to join the Navy." So I got my mother and my stepmother to do that, and off I went. But what kept me going was literally I wanted to command my own ship, and I wanted to prove my father wrong, because you're 17, you know everything. You want to tell him that what happened to you is not what's going to happen to me. So
right.
I hate to fail. I never failed at anything really, So I hate to fail, and I really did just want to command my own ship.
So it's still that young kid, that young nerd inside of you, like, that's gonna be my bridge one day.
Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead.
That's awesome. I love that. So I mean, did you eventually get command of your own ship?
No, I did 4 consecutive sea tours, and closest I got to command was I was XO on a hydrofoil out of Key West, and I got that job as the lieutenant after my engineering tour. All the other department heads were lieutenant commanders, so I was the junior department head in the squadron, junior XO in the squadron. I was the only black officer in the squadron, and so that's the closest I got. I was acting CO a couple times when my skipper was gone. But after I finished that tour, I went to a squadron, a seagoing squadron, and became the safety officer. And the captain, chief staff, after about 2 months, he called me in and said, "I want you to take I've been watching you, and I want you to take the training department." I said, "No, thank you. I'm happy where I am. I started a master's program, and I don't want the busiest job on this staff." And he said, "Keith, you know how this works. If you don't volunteer, you're probably going to wind up with it anyway." So I said, "Well, can I sleep on it?" Yeah. And he said, "Yeah, you can sleep on it. Let me know tomorrow." So I came in the next morning and volunteered. And that happened to be the best job I ever had in the Navy. We did all kinds of great stuff. That little tiny department put that squadron on the map. We really did some good stuff. And so after that, I was so junior that I was not eligible to go to be an XO on a larger ship because there were so many guys in the pipeline ahead of me. They had a reduction in force. So all these senior guys that had been to shore duty and school and stuff, they were in line to go to those jobs. And I was this young upstart, lieutenant. I started my department head tour as a frock lieutenant. So they didn't know what to do with me because I was so far ahead of the pack, but I was junior.
Right.
So, I never got command. And when I went to shore duty, everything fell apart for me because I went to work for the wrong 2 guys.
What was one of the best times you had on one of your deployments? Like, it was something like it was the funniest or the happiest, or it was just something that just was good.
Well, I'll tell you one story, and it was a moment that sticks with me for a lot of different reasons. But on my first ship, we had this little terror, an XO. We called him Little Redheaded MF, LRMF, and I don't have to tell you what the MF stood for. But he walked up to us one day, officer's call, and he's very agitated and irritated. And he walks up and he says to me, "Do you have a paper clip?" So I reached in my pocket and handed him a paper clip. So all the other guys start razzing me. "Well, how is it that, he walks up and only asks you for a paper clip and that you happen to have one?" And I just, in my best James Earl Jones voice, I said, "The very best officers always have a paper clip." And man, they howled and cursed me and whatnot. But that moment sticks with me a lot. Yeah. And the other good times were in my first ship. My captain loved to let his junior officers drive the ship, do man overboards and, maneuvers and stuff. So I got a lot of good ship handling in under him. Did my first unrep under him. And so that first sea tour was really, really good for me.
That sounds that sounds awesome. That sounds like a once in a lifetime, opportunity, getting to do maneuvers on a ship like that. And being able to, you said drive it, you actually got to drive the ship.
Yes.
That's amazing. I remember when I got to command of my first amphibious assault vehicle, and I was like, "This thing is awesome!" Like in the water, playing around with it. Granted, this is like a tiny boat, right? It's not a big ship, but I was like, "Oh, this is so cool!" But funny thing is, you say that you went to in a funny story or a good story, that good heartfelt story, when you had that paper clip. Funny thing, I was on probationary period in my law enforcement agency, and I get ready to come in, and I'm hearing the rumor mill going already this morning with all the probationary officers, and they're like, "Hey, like, just make sure you're on your toes," because apparently the day prior they got asked a question and no one knew, so they were telling me all these things, and I was like, "Oh, what was the question?" And they tell me the question. I'm like, what was the answer? And they tell me the answer. I'm like, thanks. And so I knew, I had a feeling that someone was going to put me on blast and put me at the front and ask me the same thing, and just to see if I knew it. And if I knew it, then they were all wrong and they were going to get in trouble again. But if I didn't know it, then we're all messed up, and we're probably all going to get messed up. So no matter what, we're all getting messed up. And next thing I know, I spit it off. They asked me, hey, Chuck, get up, blah, blah, blah. What's the answer? And I give it to him, and everyone's like, you son of a bitch. And they all look stupid. They're like, see, I knew it. My boot got it. He understood. And then everybody got mad at me. They're like, what the heck? And I was like, you guys told me the answer to I'm not going to say no. What do you want me to do? I'm about to have a good day. You guys aren't. But and then I left. But it was funny. It's being prepared and having that wherewithal to know, always be prepared and to always have that forward thinking. It's real special. It's awesome. But so you did a whole career and you started working on that master's program while you were in, and then you came out and you authored a book.
Yes.
What's that book?
Well, the first book, I've written 3 books. The first one, I started, maybe 4 or 5 years after I retired, and then I just put it away. And then around 2015, 2016, I decided to dust it off and try it again. And but I didn't even look at what I'd written before. I just started from scratch. In the meantime, I'd done this 10-page chronology of events of all the things that happened in my career, the significant events. And then I overlaid on top of that all the things that had happened in the Navy during that period. And then I filled it in with everything that was happening in the rest of the military and the country. So I had this chronology of, like 10 pages of stuff, significant events. And after I'd done that, it was easy to write the book because I would just talk about my career and then what was going on in the Navy and then what was going on in the nation. And from that 10,000 foot view, you started to see connections between things. You think what's going on around you is not impacted by other things, but when you can put those things together and, put the pieces of the puzzle together, it was really informative. So I self-published that in 2017, and it wasn't ready for publication, but I was so stressed out by then, I was worried I was going to have a heart attack, and I wanted the book out before I died.
What was the name of the book, and what are some of those highlights? Pardon
me?
What's the name of the book?
The name of the book was Black Officer, White Navy.
Okay.
And it had been out for a little bit, and a buddy of mine, got to be a buddy of mine, did a review on it on Naval Institute Press blog, and somebody from the University Press of Kentucky saw that review and contacted me and said, we'd like to acquire this book. And that was in maybe 2020, somewhere around there, 2018, 19. And they sent me a contract and I never did sign it. I just waited a year. And then I contacted them after a year, said, hey, are you still interested in this? And they said, yes. I'd had some health issues in the meantime. So I started working on it. Took about a year and a half. I had to take it from 178,000 words down to 100. So I had to cut out almost half the book. I got it down to the low 90s, and then got it down to the low 90s, and then added some stuff back into it. Yeah. And the epilogue in the new book details all the things that have happened since I wrote the first book, and some of the things that DOD did in response and the Navy did in response. The epilogue is really the most important part of the new book because it shows that one person can have an impact on an organization as large as the Department of Defense. I'll give you an example.
Yes,
in
please.
the first book, I had gotten all of the formal discrimination complaints throughout the entire Department of Defense for active duty people from 1987 to about 1983 or 4. And I plugged some of those numbers into my book. And I told people, I said, you don't have to take my word for it. You can go to the annual defense reports, the addendums, and look at all these numbers yourself.
Right.
And shortly after my book came out, all of that information disappeared from online. They didn't want people looking at it because the numbers really told a pretty sad story.
You're onto something at this point. Now you know.
Oh,
You're
absolutely.
like, okay, here we go.
Yeah. So rather than let people, historians or researchers or whatever, they just decided to just remove it all.
That's BS. That's bullshit. Like that's. I see that a lot lately. Like I see a lot now. Like people say stuff and then they just start. We're just going to delete that. No, like that's not. No, that's history. Like that's statistics. You know. So, what did you do in response to that? I mean, you must have done something.
Well, one of the things I did, anticipating something like that, was I downloaded every single one of those reports, printed them out, and put them in a box. So I'm probably the only person outside DoD that has that whole list of complaints. I've got memos I wrote back in 1980, so I tend to hold on to stuff like that. But one of the things I did was I filed a FOIA request for updated statistics, and they wouldn't give them to me. So I got a call from a guy at the 21st Century Sailor's office, and he said, if you give me a call, have a conversation, I will give you the data that you asked for. So I called him. We talked for about an hour, and he's trying to convince me everything is well, et cetera, et cetera. And then they didn't give me the data that I asked for. So then I filed another FOIA request for 10 years worth of all that data from DOD. 2 years later, I got nothing from the Navy, either request. I got nothing from the Coast Guard. I had multiple conversations with them. The Army and the Marines had insufficient data, and the Air Force gave me a disk that had 350 pages, 10 years worth of data, broken down by pay grade, with the disposition of the each case, the pay grade of the offender, the pay grade of the accuser. I mean, I was just blown away. And the Air Force was the only service that was following the guidelines and doing what they were supposed to do. DOD did an investigation on those complaints, I think in response to some of the stuff that I've been writing. And the DOD IG found that 91% of complaints are not properly completed or investigated. So the system was failing not only the people that were using it, but the commanding officers that it was there to, to guide. So it was worse than I thought it was.
Wow. And that all stemmed from this after the first book into the second book.
Yes, because I got on LinkedIn and I started writing and I did some articles. If you go to CIMSEC, Center for International Maritime Security, I've got about 5 articles on there, including this latest one from Garrison Payne. And I did an article about renaming the USS John C. Stennis with proceedings. And I also did another one just recently about the tragedy of the lost generation, about how the Southern congressmen for many years would not nominate any Black people to go to the military academies. So the gap in the officer ranks is like 6% in the Navy, and it should be about 13. That gap can be traced directly back to people like John C. Stennis, who never in 41 years nominated a Black person to any military academy.
Wow. That's crazy. I mean, what are the statistics now? What is it now?
You mean overall Navy, or I can tell you what the Navy statistics are. Yeah. The Navy is about 8%, maybe 8.5, and the population should be about 13. It should be, if you're going with numerical demographics, it should be closer to like 13 or 15. Now the Navy's got well over 20%, I think, Black enlistees in the Navy, but they're underrepresented in the officer ranks.
That's sad. I mean, and do you think that's going to change in the future?
Actually, it's going to get worse from my perspective, because the last couple of classes at the Naval Academy, the percentage of Black candidates, midshipmen coming in, was like 6%. So you can't get from 6% to 13% if you don't have the bodies there to do it. In addition to that, a lot of those people will face discrimination in the military. It's just a fact. And a lot of them at about the 10, 12 year point decide, I've had enough of this, and off they go. I did a story interview with KPBS out of San Diego, public radio station, about why there were so few black officers in the Navy. And this guy calls me up and says, I'd like to talk to you about why there's so few black officers in the Navy. And I laughed. I said, I retired as a lieutenant commander. I said, why the hell you want to talk to me? He said, because an admiral said that you were the guy I needed to talk to. And because of all the writing I'd been doing. And so I gave him my thoughts on that. And I mean, you can find that online. But the admiral that was also on the program said that, people get tired of fighting these battles. Not only do you have to do all the other stuff that every other officer has to do, but you got to fight the racism and the discrimination on top of that. And he called it Death Valley about the 12-year point, and they just throw in the towel, and which is what I almost did in that first engineering tour. I almost quit.
Yeah, I think any other person probably would have, but your drive to command your ship is what really carried you. And I think a lot of other people would have just been like, nah, I'm done. I'd throw in the towel, especially nowadays. Nah, move on to something else. I'm done, which is sad too, because you have people who have a calling to come into the military that needs to be fostered and that needs to be nurtured. It's hard enough to get people into law enforcement and in the military nowadays in general, and then they have all that stuff to deal with. I got out in 2010, and it was we didn't have too much of that stuff going on in our unit. Our unit didn't really have to deal with any of that stuff. I know it was happening. I heard about it in other platoons and shit like that going on around us. We never got to deal with any of it. Thank God. But it must be tough being a black man or a black woman in the modern day military. And what do you think can do to improve that culture now?
Well, accountability is the one facet that seems to be missing. And I got a call from Task Force 1 Navy when they did that report about right after the George Floyd killing. I got a call from the Secretary of Defense's office, his senior enlisted advisor, Ramon CZ Lopez, and I got a call from Admiral Halsey on Task Force 1 Navy because of all the hell I was raising on LinkedIn. And I told them both the same thing. I said, it does not matter what your report says. There's a stack of reports that look just like the one you're about to do that says some of the same things. But what you need to do is start holding people accountable for their behavior. Until people see blood on the floor, they're not going to believe it's real. And I turned out to be right.
So just continue to bring awareness to help hold people accountable is what you think will help change in the near future.
Well, that, and I wrote an article about, because there was a senior officer who was relieved. I think he was a Marine, as a matter of fact. He did not realize that the stuff that he was doing was racist. He didn't even understand what racism was, some of the behaviors that he was involved in. And because there is no Uniform Code of Military Justice article for racism. There's one for disrespect, and disrespect is whatever the person you're disrespecting says it is, So that is very subjective, but there is none for a racist behavior. So I wrote, along with my co-author, Dr. John Cordell, we wrote an article.
Would that almost be hate speech, though?
Pardon me?
So I know in law enforcement we have you're protected under the freedom of speech and stuff like that, but you have things called hate speech and on the border of hate crimes and things like that. That there's no is there not a section for that in the UCMJ?
there are various elements of other offenses of the UCMJ, but what I said was we need to address the specific behavior that is someone does to someone else because of their race, their color, their ethnicity, whatever. And we laid it out with help from a JAG officer.
Okay.
There's one for sexual harassment. There's one for sexual assault. There's one for disrespect. These are all about behaviors, but there is none. Truman desegregated the armed forces in 1948. The Uniform Code of Military Justice was issued in 1950. And from 1948 to today, there is no separate offense for racist behavior, actions. You can't get into trouble for what you think. You know, you can think whatever you want. You can be as racist as you want to be, but it's your behavior. If your behavior shows that you're treating people differently because of the way they look or, you know, whatever, then that behavior should be held accountable. And people don't know that some of the stuff that they do is racist.
It's you know, inciting words of violence, things like that, and that's even a crime in the regular you know, penal code. And you know, anything that can incite violence is technically a crime. It's a misdemeanor, you know, and that needs to be held accountable. And you can we have those protections in there, because if you have someone on the sidewalk and he's yelling, you know, slurs and stuff like that are going to be inciting violence, we can arrest him for disturbing the peace for inciting violence, and boom, you're in jail for the rest of the night. Yeah. You know,
in the military, it's UCMJ Article 117, provoking speeches and gestures.
That's crazy. I mean, definitely a system that needs to be revamped for sure. I think that I've seen some crazy stuff going on in the military. I had a friend of mine, he actually got busted down, reduction of rate maxed out, because he went to the beach in North Carolina and we went body surfing and he broke his neck, and they got him for destruction of government property.
Yeah.
you see stuff like that. And then they don't have anything there for, you know, racist and derogatory comments, you know, that could, you know, that, I mean, come on, some of that stuff is it almost seems archaic. Like, you got to change it and get with the program and the times, you know.
And the problem is when people bring forth racist behavior, the system is designed to circle the wagons around the person that's accused, and they'll do anything they can to make this something other than racist behavior.
Yeah, because they don't want that black eye. They don't want that in their area. Not at all.
In 1988, the CNO said there was widespread bias and discrimination against blacks in the Navy. It was in the New York Times, and that was in June. And then in October, said there's widespread bias and promotion against blacks in the Navy. So that was in 1988. The DOD started keeping statistics on discrimination complaints in 87. And in 87 in the Navy, there was like 50 complaints and 6% were substantiated. In 1988, there was about 100 complaints and 3% were substantiated. And in 1989, the year after the CNO said there was widespread bias and discrimination against blacks, there was 156 complaints and 0 of them were substantiated. So you've got the number of complaints increasing, but the substantiation rate goes from a low of 6% to absolute 0.
Yeah, I don't doubt it.
You know, that's an inverse curve. And the reason it happened is because no skipper in the fleet was going to be the first guy to report that, yes, I've got a racist on my ship discriminating against black people. So they did anything and everything they could to cover it up.
That doesn't surprise me one bit at all. I've seen so many things get covered. I'm like, okay. All right. Like in 2007, when I went to boot camp, 2007, I'm a young guy. So we went to boot camp, and then there was a big hazing ordeal in ITing and stuff like that. So there's a bunch of cases that have been brought to light. Some kid, I guess, got thrown into a big dryer, fucking died. And another one was getting IT'd, and his heart, I guess, stopped. And so there was a bunch of investigations at that point, and they got to the point where we were being investigated by NCIS for hazing, for all this other stuff, and nothing came of it. And we even had a kid get his arm snapped in boot camp from being IT'd way too hard.
Yeah.
And nothing happened. And honestly, he probably one of the strongest willed gentlemen I have known. And he took that broken arm for the next week and graduated, and then was like, all right, it's broken. Like, I need to go and get it fixed. And, that was just, you see shit like that and you're like, how you were being investigated. Like, he broke his arm. Like, yeah, good on him for not saying anything and not getting us investigated. But also, what the fuck?
Right.
At the same time, you're like, that's wrong. That shouldn't be. Like, I get breaking people down to build them back up to make them better, but at some point you got to know when to stop. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of too much. And shame on everyone else for not saying anything. Shame on me but at the same time, we had no idea, and he kept that hidden very well. And next thing we know, we're like, oh, he broke his arm. Like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So it's like you see stuff like that constantly getting covered up. And honestly, I love the military. I think it's a good thing. I think anyone who wants to go to college should go to the military because they can get all that good benefits. But at the same time, there are bad people in every act and walk of life, and there are going to be shitheads everywhere. But this is a very important to you. You wrote another. You got the story of William Garrison Payne, the U.S. Navy's first Black commissioned officer. You recently wrote that, correct?
I was sitting at home one day minding my own business, and I get this phone call. It's this white guy from Indiana telling me that his great-grandmother's half-brother was the first Black officer in the Navy. And I'm like, I'm waiting for the Twilight Zone music because I think this is a prank,
Right.
Or, I've, gone into another dimension.
What I mean? Like,
yeah. And he's from Indiana.
wow.
So we talked a little bit, and he starts sending me these emails with these embedded documents and pictures and stuff. And it slowly dawned on me that this is real. He had reached out to all sorts of organizations trying to get them to pay attention, but it was such a crazy story, nobody would really pay any attention. So I started doing some digging, and I ordered a couple books online, printed in the 80s. One was War and Race, and the other was the modernization of the U.S. Navy, 1898 to 1940, I think it was.
Okay.
And I put everything in context, and that's when I published that article. But up until then, everyone thought that Dory Miller was the first Black guy to win the Navy Cross in 1919. Dory Miller wasn't even born when Garrison Payne earned his Navy Cross in 1918. And everybody thought the Navy commissioned its first Black officers in 1945, the Golden 13, and they did that in 1917 with Garrison Payne.
Wow. So you were able to write history.
Say again?
I said you were able to write history.
Yes, changes the course of the Navy's history as far as Black officers or Black enlisted people go. And it was picked up by the Doughboy Foundation. They put a link into it. Some maritime UK outfit did it. It's been picked up in the Philippines. But so far, I've heard nothing from the Navy. I know the Navy Historical and Heritage Command is aware of it. And I know Naval Institute Press, they sent me a nice note about it. And I sent the story to All Hands Magazine, the Navy's magazine, said, you guys ought to think about running a story on this in Black History Month in February. And I may be doing another podcast in February talking about, that whole thing. But I pulled all that together, and I learned a lot in the process.
That's pretty awesome. I mean, wow, you were able to change the course of history and unearth something that no one knew before and bring light to it. And I think that is freaking special. And that is just, wow. I mean,
yeah, I'm not sure.
I don't understand how important that is, like how special that is. Just, man, it takes my words right out of my mouth.
Well, I can tell you, considering the time when this happened, it really makes it significant because Woodrow Wilson was the president in 1919. 1913 to 1919, Josephus Daniels was the Secretary of the Navy. And he's the guy that resegregated he banned the enlistment of blacks in 1919, the year after Garrison Payne won his Navy Cross and commanded his first ship. And Woodrow Wilson is the guy that screened Birth of a Nation in the White House in 1915 and refused to condemn the violence in the Red Summer of 1919. In 1919, there were sailors in Washington, D.C. that went into restaurants in the district, pulled the black men working in the kitchens out of the restaurants and beat them in the middle of the street just for sport. And a lot of those guys were veterans as well. So, there was a lot of racial violence after each war, World War I, World War II, and of course we know about some of the stuff from the Vietnam era. But World War I, Korea was one of the first wars where you didn't have a lot of that widespread racial violence.
Why do you think that is? If we've seen it every other time, why that one?
Well, I think because that conflict was I won't say it was more limited, but it wasn't part of the American consciousness like World War II and the Vietnam War was. And there were very few. Korea's when they really started integrating the army in particular. But I don't know exactly why that was, but it just seemed to be that there were relatively few blacks in the military at that time.
Mm-hmm. Now, your time in the military, I mean, you dealt with a lot of animosity, a lot of things that were racist, but you dealt with a lot of good things as well, because I don't think you would have stayed there as long as you did if you didn't have some good things that had happened. I mean, what are some of the, I guess the things you look back on that you're like, man, that really bring you back to your military days?
Well, when I ran that training department, the job that I didn't want turned out to be the best job that I ever had. Mm-hmm. That job allowed me to really impact the level of training and readiness for ships getting ready to deploy, ships in the Mayport Basin. We had a mobile wet trainer that we would have to order from Pascagoula, Mississippi, and they'd send a crew over there to man it. And it was very expensive travel and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And they cut it because of funding. So I had a Master Chief Bosun mate working for me. He said, Lieutenant, he said, we can build one of those things. I said, you think so? We had acquired a mobile training team, a bunch of HTs and damage controlmen. Some of these guys were welders. I said, yeah, we can build one of those. So not knowing any better, I said, all right, let's do it. So we started building this thing. The Master Chief could get anything, got a big trailer and some metal plates and stuff and valves. And we got in over our head. So I asked the SEMA, the Shore Maintenance Facility, I asked my Commodore to have them help us finish the thing up. And so he did, and they were dragging their feet. And finally I had to go over there. This warrant officer was jerking us around. So I had to go over there and put on my ugly face and call him a bunch of names. And then I followed him down to the morning meeting and I called his boss a bunch of names in front of all his people. And that's when I snapped to my senses and went back to my office because I was expecting either to get hung up in the building or get court-martialed. Well, my chief of staff and I had to go over there, have a come to Jesus meeting with them. And I was able to prove that they were lying to him and delaying this thing. So they wound up working 3-day holiday weekend, double shifts on that war wagon because they'd made their skipper look like an idiot. But when we got it finished, it was so popular. It was very cheap. We moved it ourselves. We didn't have to pay anybody. And it was so popular and so effective that it was written up in Surface Warfare Magazine. They sent a crew down and did a big story about it in Surface Warfare Magazine, this fabulous self-help effort that we had accomplished. So I did stuff like that in that job. And that was great because we would use it as part of our Surface Warfare Training Week competitions. The other thing I did, we had what was called Sweat Week, Surface Warfare Training Week. And it was always drudgery. So I decided we're going to make this interesting and more competitive. So I set up where the ship servicemen and the cooks would have a cook-off at the enlisted club at the end of the thing. And that was the last event before we decided who won. So these guys would go all out. I mean, they would use costumes and music and displays and whatnot. And it was really like going to the United Nations to eat. And it was really a big deal. And all the skippers and XOs are now coming over, and we'd have one of the senior guys judge the competition. And the only person that knew for sure who was ahead was a first-class petty officer that worked for me. I said, I don't want to know. You keep track of these numbers, and that way you'll be the guy that announces the winner. So it turned from a drudgery to something where, on that Friday once a month, all these senior khakis and enlisted sailors over there just having a great time. So that was something that went from
That's
really hellish to a big deal.
Wow. Seems like you've been an awesome person to work for. I'm not gonna lie. You did a lot of really like awesome things. It's pretty cool. I like to ask everyone who comes on the show, imparting parts of wisdom onto the next generation. Is there anything that you could impart onto the next generation coming up? Maybe those who are looking into the military or something into giving back to their community. Any words of wisdom you can impart onto them as we get ready to close out?
I would tell people that I don't care who you are going to face some sort of adversity. You're going to have to deal with something, and you're going to have to make a decision on what to do. And I learned when I was 12 years old that when you're dealing with a bully, the smartest thing you can do is punch him in the mouth. You may get your ass beat, but that bully will be careful around you from then on. Mm-hmm. So I grew up with an older brother who was a bully. So I learned that lesson early. But you have to decide how much you're willing to take when you know that it's wrong. And I tell people, no one will know that you have fangs unless you show them to them. Right. And you have to be very selective on when you show your fangs and to whom you show them. But if you don't draw a line somewhere, you're going to wind up getting stomped all over. I said something in my second book that I didn't say in the first one. And I said that the best way to keep your hands from shaking is to turn them into fists. And that was after reading about that little XO that I'd worked for, the little redheaded MF. He got slapped around by his XO on a battleship, relieved in the middle of the night because he wouldn't stand up for himself, but he was doing to us the same thing that happened to him. And someone saw this XO grab him up and slap him around, and his hands were shaking, and he and I had a run in, and, I balled up my fist and said a bunch of stuff to him in combat because he just pegged out my abuse meter, and I wasn't going to take it anymore.
Oh, I bet. We had I was going to say we had a gunny, a little gunny that we used to call, what's that one Looney Tune character's name? Little redheaded cowboy.
Foghorn Leghorn?
Oh, Pistol Pete. Yeah. I think Pistol Pete, that crazy little redhead, because he was a crazy little redheaded dude with a big ass mustache, and he was just a cantankerous, angry little guy. Looked like a garden gnome. So yeah.
The best thing I can say is you're going to have to draw a line to stand up for yourself somewhere, because if you don't, you're going to get screwed.
Right. One of I love that. I love your message, and one of the best messages that was ever kind of told to me coming up early in my career is be respectful, but don't ever be anyone's bitch.
Right.
So I think it goes along with those lines, pretty much the same way. Be respectful, Absolutely. But don't let people walk all over you.
That's right.
That's amazing. Well, to punching bullies in the mouth. At the end of every episode, we like to give our guests the chance to dedicate an episode to a fallen brother or sister. And Keith, do you have a dedication you wish to read, or did you dedicate an episode to?
Actually, I don't have anything that I have to read. I can't think of anybody right now outside of family to do a dedication to. But there's always somebody out there that, if you think about it long enough, that touched your life that's not here anymore. And I just dedicate it to all those people.
To all those people, thank you. We are going to dedicate this episode to a fallen service member as well. We're going to dedicate this episode to Agent Davis Giovanni Martinez. Agent Davis Martinez was stabbed while conducting a home visit on a convicted sex offender in the 2800 block of Terrace Drive in Chevy Chase. Officers from the Montgomery County Police Department went to check on Agent Martinez after he failed to return to his office. The officer discovers his body at the offender's apartment, suffering from multiple stab wounds. The subject had fled the scene, but was arrested in Hurricane, West Virginia. The following day, a member of the United States Marshal Service Task Force, he has been charged with second-degree murder, they advised. Agent Martinez had served with the Maryland Division of Parole and Probation for 6 years and was assigned to the Silver Springs Field Office. He was 33 years old. His tour was 6 years, and his badge number is 2422. Rest easy, brother. We have it from here.
Absolutely.
Well,
That's a powerful story.
Yeah, it's rough, and we hate to never have to read one of those ever again. And we'll stop doing this podcast when we no longer have to read any more of those. But unfortunately, the stark reminder is that the job is dangerous, the job is dirty, the job is nasty, the job is violent, and death is inevitable, but it's never wanted. It's a sad day when we have to read these. But I want to say thank you all today for tuning in. If you did enjoy today's episode, be sure to follow us on Instagram at @war_stories_official and our Facebook at War Stories Podcast. If you're already following us, we really appreciate it if you could share our post and help spread the word. You can also check us out in the link on our bio on both platforms. On both platforms to find all of our social media, our media links, and website. Our podcast is available on all major streaming platforms, including YouTube. If you'd like to support us, head over to our website at www.warstoriesofficial.com and grab some merch. Do you have a story to tell, or you know someone who does? We're always looking for law enforcement, corrections officers, dispatchers, firefighters, medics, and veterans to feature on the show, but always ER nurses and those ER doctors, because we know you guys have some crazy stories. You can email us at booking.warstories@gmail.com and share your story. We'd love to have you on. If you know someone who'd be a great fit, please send them our way. Thank you for support. Stay safe out there. And as always, till our next episode, come home with your shield or on it.